So tonight I'm going to start by talking about climate change and sort of contextualize the talk in that sense, talk about the bit around the global context of renewable energy, really focus mostly on what Ontario has recently done in its Green Energy Act, and then talk about what that means for Alberta and what Alberta could learn from what's gone on in Ontario. But I think it's important to start off with climate change and understand, particularly because the Copenhagen negotiations are coming up in about 6 weeks from now, and that really is sort of Kyoto, the next phase of the Kyoto discussions. But I think what's important to recognize is that all of the major scientific studies that have been done have actually all been underestimates of what we're actually seeing in the ground today. And so the rate of change that we're seeing is actually what we're seeing in the ground was actually more happening faster than the worst case scenario of the scientific data that's been out there. And so there's all sorts of evidence of glacial retreat and Arctic warming, but you can see these are the different scientific predictions in terms of where they thought the temperatures might be rising. And you can see that the actual data is actually above even the worst case scenario. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about climate change and the urgency for action. The issue that we're really faced with in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years is that if we get to the point of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, where we get to the point where the Earth warms to about 2 degrees above 1990 levels, the best science, and again, to date the science has been conservative, but the best science figures at that point in time, we probably lose control of the system in the sense that you could cut off all emissions and there's positive feedback loops where you've got methane being released in the Arctic, for example, it's basically out of our hands at that point in time. So if we don't act sort of in the next 30 years to stop this, we've lost control of the system. And so these are the different scenarios in terms of where the temperature on the Earth could go, and if we wanted to curb it below 2 degrees, you can see the time frame here. We're looking at sort of 2040, 2050 is when we really have to have this thing under control. And we're talking about energy systems. We're talking about electricity systems and oil and gas development, transmission line development, these sorts of things, or housing. These sorts of things, 20, 30, 40 years those types of decisions need to be made right now. We're talking about decisions that need to be happening right now. We don't really have the luxury of putting this off any longer. So in terms of what we have to do as Canadians if we want to be taking climate change seriously, and what our responsibility is to the planet, if we want to keep global emissions down below 2 degrees of warming, if you were to take that sort of amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and divide it equitably among every single person on the planet, we would have to get down to about 1.2 tons of carbon per year. And I know that doesn't necessarily mean anything to anybody, but what you should recognize is where we're at right now is we're at about 19 tons of carbon per Canadian per year. So our footprint right now is about roughly 18 times the size of what it should be in terms of if we wanted to equitably distribute carbon across the planet. And so that's the scale of the challenge that's ahead of us as Canadians. That's the type of reductions we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at sort of 90% reductions in terms of emissions that we currently create. Canada is one of the top 10 polluters on the planet, not only in terms on a per capita level, but on an absolute basis, where I think we're the 8th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So we have an important role to play, not only as leading the way in terms of industrialized nations leading the way, but we actually have an important role to play in reducing our own emissions. Alberta, unfortunately, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. So Canada is one of the top emitters globally, and Alberta is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, and in fact is the largest source of growing emissions in Canada. It's expected to almost add 50% emissions in the next 10 years or so, largely because of the growth in the oil sands. And obviously the oil sands get a lot of bad rap, and there they are down there, and probably deservedly so, but I think it's important to recognize that the electricity system in Alberta, which is coal-based, actually contributes the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as all the oil sands. And so you can see from this graph here the relative amounts. Oil sands has been growing in importance, or growing in emissions, but roughly the same amount of emissions come from the electricity generated in Alberta from the coal plants as from the oil sands. And so electricity in Alberta needs to be cleaned up. It's a really big deal. It's on par with oil sands, as I said. So that's looking at it from a global warming point of view. And there's still a handful of skeptics out there in terms of the science, but the fact of the matter is governments are going to be acting on global warming in the very near future. And we're going to see a price on pollution in the very near future. And so whether you're a skeptic or not, it almost becomes irrelevant, because we're going to be seeing policies that are going to start curbing emissions, or at least making people pay for them. And so what's going on right now in the United States is the Waxman-Markey bill, which is trying to get through the American Senate, and they're looking at potentially a fairly weak price of about $20 a ton of carbon. Total Oil, which is developing the oil sands now, they're predicting about $40 a ton of carbon price. Even in the federal government, turning the corner plan, Stephen Harper has mentioned about a $65 a ton of carbon in the carbon capture and storage. Forecasts we've seen are anywhere between $40 to $150 a ton. So I know dollars per ton doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot to anybody, but in terms of what that means, in terms of what that translates into of electricity cost, if we're looking at $150 a ton of carbon on your coal-based electricity, you're looking at doubling, tripling, quadrupling the price of electricity in Alberta. So that's what that means in real terms.